A few months ago, we looked into one of the biggest mysteries of Halo 3 ODST that still to this day has not been solved. It was a really fun investigation where we looked at all of the different glyphs scattered throughout Mombasa streets and tried to connect some of the evidence to prove there's definitely more going on than just what we see on the surface. It was a really great experience just to dive into a game like ODST, but also along the way, we may have turned some of you guys into tin-foil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists who may have joined our ranks. But seriously, we never expected that video to kind of spark this massive search throughout the community, which was really cool to experience. And this search for a meaning behind ODST, or the deeper story that's hidden underneath the surface of ODST, is larger than ever. And we might have just made one of the biggest breakthroughs yet. Okay, but before we fully dive into this, just double check that you are subscribed with notifications on. We put a ton of work into these videos, and hey, it helps us out a lot. But Halo 3 ODST is loaded. There are so many underlying secrets that span much further than just some meanings behind a few glyphs that are on various walls. But we think, slowly but surely, we may be figuring out why more progress over the last decade hasn't been made. And it's because we've been looking in the wrong place all along. And while last time we started from the very beginning and we focused on getting everyone caught up to a lot of the theories and speculation that the community has managed to come up with, but even with that 20+ minute video we did, it was surface level at best. We focused in on the symbols alone, along with a few other notes of interest, but we failed to recognize that Halo 3 ODST was released by Bungie at the peak of their glory days. And Bungie has always had the track record of hiding some of the most complex and deep secrets within their games. So after the video went out, when we decided we wanted to really dig in and look into this even more, we knew that this time we would need to consider everything and anything. So over the past few months, Luke and I and our extended group of friends who have volunteered their time helping us have spent hundreds of hours studying, researching, and connecting some dots where we could. We've talked to so many people who've been involved in the search over the years, and the new depth that we can look at with ODST is something much deeper and way more meaningful than any of us initially expected. Okay, so in the past on this channel, we've talked a bit about how when we played New Mombasa, we weren't really fans of replaying through the streets section of the game. Don't get us wrong, we've always expressed our appreciation for the first time experiencing the streets. But lately, the deeper we've looked into ODST and this recurring feeling that there's always more to the story around every corner, and the really great attention to detail in the atmosphere and world building, along with, you know, the significance of the story in the context of the Halo universe and the outstanding soundtrack that adds so much weight, emotion, and verisimilitude to the game, it really has allowed us to come back time and time again for this video, and we haven't grown tired of this level yet, and really it's becoming one of our favorite levels in all of Halo. So it's really cool to see how this search has changed our perspective on a piece of Halo history so much. But there is so much to unpack, so many explicit details we all as a community may have missed, or lore tidbits that we knew but never connected. So for this video, we need to divide this into like 5 different parts maybe. We're going to base this video at the beginning in order of the confidence of the arguments and statements that we're making, starting by going through topics on what we know for sure, what we think based off of the evidence, what theories we are still considering, some of the new leads that we've made along the way that we haven't fully been able to connect yet, and then we also want to debunk some of the very common things that a lot of people are asking, very common questions that have already been debunked, so that we're all caught up and not diving down rabbit holes that may have already been fleshed out. So what do we know? Well, our video went out and we had that overwhelming amount of support, and honestly, that was so cool to be a part of this reignited search for answers. And even Marty O'Donnell chimed in with a cryptic tweet that drove people crazy. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he regretted that tweet, considering how often he must get bombarded with, "Marty, the glyphs, what do they mean?" But let's start by looking at that tweet, because this is kind of the most recent lead that ties us a little closer to some other things going on. So, August 21st, 2020, Marty O'Donnell tweeted, "Is it time to unravel the mystery from the land of cactus?" Mind you, this was just about a day after our video went out, and he also included an image of the glyphs. Then a day later, he replied to his tweet saying, "Still having fun? Why? and then, capitalization on the Y and a frowny face. And I think this was maybe the apex of the hype of possibly resolving or figuring out clues, getting us closer to suggesting the underlying secret that's hidden in ODST, as it seemed like we were maybe on the brink of making a massive discovery, and then radio silence. Okay, so Land of Cactus, let's start with that, and what could that mean? That's actually not the first time that we've looked into the Land of Cactus or this suggestion, because that's actually a line straight out of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men, and we briefly touched on it in our first video that there was a lot of theories suggesting there were connections to the Hollow Men, but we didn't dive into it too much. And while Marty hasn't really talked about the glyphs or the secrets behind ODST since then, it's pretty clear that the point of making the tweet in the first place was to essentially remind people that there is, in fact, an Easter egg there. It's not just some creepypasta speculation type thing. This is something that had some thought at least put into it during the game's development. But the reason that it wasn't just explicitly shown off, because if the Halo community could spend 11 plus years looking for answers, would a generic reveal really be as satisfying to players who have wondered this? I mean, maybe, but you know what? Let's get into more about this poem and what we know about it. Okay, so in 1925, poet T.S. Eliot wrote this poem, Hollow Men. He said it had to do with the emptiness of the spirit, but was popularized really heavily during the Cold War era decades later out of fears of hydrogen bombs and nuclear bombs being used in warfare. We see T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men referenced many times actually throughout Halo, not just in some tweets or other things in ODST. This is something that's been alluded to in Halo since the Cortana letters, way before Halo 1 even released, all the way through Halo 3 and in ODST and onwards. We'll dive a little more on this later, but the Hollow Men also draws literary allusions to Inferno by Dante, which was written in the 1300s, something that Bungie actually confirmed on multiple occasions drew inspiration for ODST during development. Now, of course, when you start to theorize with the words and lines that are in Hollow Men, it gets really hard to interpret what is a factual allusion in a video game versus possibly us who are speculating falling into something called confirmation bias, where essentially, since we are looking for answers, everything and anything can seemingly fit together while maybe not actually being the true intentions behind this hidden mystery. But one thing we didn't really dive into in our last investigation was how involved was Dante's Inferno with Halo 3 ODST. Sure, Sadie's story especially is a really great condensed allegory of Dante's work. I mean, let alone besides Bungie explicitly saying that there was inspiration from Dante, and mind you, not the Dante's Inferno video game, the actual literary work. In ODST, we see hell break out on Earth as Sadie descends further into the city. Matter of fact, while we collect the audio logs, if you look at how they're organized in the HUD, you'll see that they aren't divided into things like chapters or sections. They're divided into the actual circles that are represented in the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. In Inferno, we actually see the poet Dante descend through all 9 circles of hell, guided by a spirit named, of all things, Virgil. As Dante descends, he witnesses the different types of sins represented in each circle. Now, going in order from the outermost circle down to the lowest circle of hell, we see limbo, lust, gluttony, greed, anger, heresy, violence, fraud, and lastly, the 9th circle, the pit of hell per se, treachery. And right away, since we know that there's this intentional inspiration drawn from Sadie's story, we can easily see how things line up through her experiences. In the beginning, Sadie's in limbo when the train starts, lust happens when Kingsler tries to make a move on her, gluttony with the barbecue guy who's way too large to leave the city, we see greed with the lady smashing the slot machines, we experience anger when Sadie's in the crowded area and people are shoving, heresy when Sadie and Mike are betrayed by Tom and the Oliphant, who tried to turn them into the brutes and make some weird alliance with them that backfired. During the circle with violence, that's when we see the massacre in the police station. And lastly, we see examples of fraud and treachery when we see Mike and Sadie fake a heist to turn Virgil back on and then face off against Kinsler himself, who betrayed and corrupted the entire police department in a move to put himself in a more powerful position where he could take advantage of people. Okay, now all of this is extremely explicit, and a lot of people probably didn't catch the direct references in each circle of Sadie's story, but if we look a little further, we'll start to see parallel imagery of Inferno through the perspective of our favorite narcoleptic character, Rookie. But Elijah, what does this have to do with the glyphs? And we understand, we need to kind of go further down the rabbit hole before we can start to speculate how the glyphs all tie back together with this, but this other storyline or underlying plot line that's in the belly of ODST is very important if we're going to even understand the atmosphere and every aspect of this game. Then you'll kind of see where I'm getting at. We need to talk about the Prophet of Regret real quick too while we're getting into this. I know the Prophet Regret seems like a really odd choice to look into, but you'll see how it all ties together once we look at the lore that we know for sure is canon and how it relates to ODST. Okay, so if you're not super familiar with Halo lore, essentially the Covenant is led by 3 religious leaders known as prophets. And essentially in Halo 2, one of the prophets begins the invasion on Earth because he discovered that what is believed to be the Ark, it's actually the portal to the Ark, was found in a luminary, and the Prophet of Regret had no idea that humans were even on Earth. But he was ambitious to further the great journey and headed to Earth hastily. But there's one massive subplot going on that a lot of people overlooked when they look at the main story and kind of the politics side of the Covenant during Halo 2, 3, and now also what we see in Halo 3 ODST. It is written in the lore and canonically that the Prophet of Truth already knew about the humans being on Earth, and he kept it a secret so Regret would look bad. And while Regret was on his way to Earth, Truth was actually putting together an enormous fleet of Covenant that were led by brutes to take over the battle on Earth after Regret would undoubtedly be blindsided. Now, how did Truth know about humans? Now, we never get an exact confirmation, though we suspect at the end of I Love Bees, that big Halo 2 marketing promotion that revealed this audio story, that the characters at the end of I Love Bees activate a Forerunner artifact that actually tells the Covenant that there are humans on Earth and that there's Forerunner artifacts on Earth. So theoretically, possibly Truth got the information from there, though we do know canonically, nonetheless, Truth did know about humanity's presence on Earth. And prior to ODST's release, there was a lot of fans who were wondering why Halo 3 ODST wouldn't feature elites as the enemy class. And Bungie, during this time, did an in-lore explanation on Bungie.net confirming that Truth ordered the brutes to kill the elites prematurely because Truth didn't trust them and didn't want them finding the Ark and then questioning his motives later on. He knew that the brutes would blindly follow him, and that's why he conspired against Regret long before Regret even launched his assault on Earth. That's some pretty treacherous betrayal right there. So the brutes are actually deployed alongside the engineers during the events of Halo 3 ODST, and they begin their search for the Ark. Now, engineers have historically been responsible for finding Forerunner artifacts, so it makes sense that Truth would send them off so that they could find the Ark, or what would turn out to be the portal to the Ark. Still under the section of things we know for certain, also in Sector 8, when playing through Mombasa streets, we see brutes struggling to hold down an engineer to strap a bomb to it, and the brute even says to let him roam so it can do the Prophet's work. During Sadie's story, we actually learn that 7 engineers tried to escape the Covenant, and 6 of them died, saving the 7th, who would go on and repair the Superintendent, and is the one we save in ODST, Virgil. And while other sources of lore suggest that these engineers typically were okay with having the bomb strapped to them, as engineers are essentially just sentient supercomputers made by the Forerunners, and they really don't trust most humans and worry about how humans could desecrate a Forerunner object, since, you know, what happened in Halo 1. So a lot of the engineers are kind of in the mindset they don't want to be captured by the humans and would rather have these bombs strapped to them. Though it seemed like some of the brutes may have forced some of those engineers to be straight up suicide bombers, and they didn't really appreciate that, so that's why only a few tried to escape, and we see the engineer quick to adjust, or Virgil in the case of ODST. But we wanted to point out that we're definitely not seeing a full-on engineer revolution against the brutes or the Covenant or anything like that. The engineers are actually pretty apathetic with everything going on and all of the war, and kind of just want to go with the flow. Okay, then another thing we also can take away from the lore and Sadie's story is that we know that that one escaped engineer that becomes Virgil makes his way underground as early as during Sadie's story, which means during the course of ODST, Virgil was well underground, And it might be important to note that those glyphs all throughout Mombasa streets only started showing up at night during the time of maybe Kikowani Station and the Mombasa streets level. Okay, so now we have kind of the unbiased factual evidence in front of us. Can we start to piece this together and make some sort of timeline or story relation based off of all of this evidence? Well, this is what we believe based on what we know for certain. Now that we've fallen down this rabbit hole of lore and we try to start to connect things, these engineers are obviously looking for the Ark. And since the glyphs most likely can't be the superintendent since he's down in the data hive during the course of ODST, it makes us suspect that these glyphs are being written by the engineers that are still working alongside the brutes, causing us to believe that it's most likely the case that these glyphs, with possibly the exceptions to the ones that are in weapon caches, can't be Virgil's glyphs, but in fact the other engineers that are looking for that Ark. Matter of fact, when we play on the level data hive to get Virgil, we don't see any glyphs anywhere in this entire level. But then when we go to the legendary ending, we see a ton of glyphs everywhere along with a ton of other engineers everywhere. And of course, markings of the superintendent as well, which means that in the time that the ODSTs left the data hive and the engineers show up and continue their potential search, all of these glyphs are here now. And I think it's safe to make the argument that these are Covenant glyphs, not friendly glyphs by Virgil. And while from a level design perspective, the glyphs very obviously exist to show players where they are supposed to go and where key points of interest are in most cases, not in all cases, we theorize that these glyphs are actually the engineers looking at points of interest along the way on their own search. And the markings of the superintendent all around the core has to be significant because for once we actually, to an extent, might understand what this glyph could mean. Something along the lines of, hey, this is where the superintendent is or was. Also, throughout ODST, much like I Love Bees, we run payphone to little computers picking up audio logs and stories. And to further our evidence the glyphs aren't Virgil's, we see Virgil directly lead the rookie by different means, not the glyphs. You download the map and he uses the cameras around the city to set up beacons on points of interest for rookie. And he changes the signs and other electronics actively as you're walking to lead players on their way or to lead the rookie on his way. We knew this was the case, but we didn't realize how explicit it is when you're actually just trying to follow the directions of the game based off of how Virgil manipulates electronics to lead you. Matter of fact, we jumped on Mombasa streets in a fresh game and we were able to find every single audio log except maybe just one of them by following Virgil's instructions without using an online map or anything else in not that long of a time compared to how long it takes when you do look at a map. From a lore perspective, if Virgil's already leading players with the electronics and he was telling the other engineers to put glyphs all over the place, why didn't he just have the engineers make an exact roadmap or pathway? We really like the theory that these are two separate factions altogether. Okay, there's another really interesting thing when it comes to Data Hive as well, and this one's kind of crazy. A lot of people who are really familiar with the Dante references in ODST really love to point to this level, and I think the people from the Secret Glyph Project all the way to various people in our Discord have made some great theories pointing to the imagery on Data Hive, but we think they might be missing something really big, and this is where we made one of the biggest breakthroughs that we felt was the coolest accomplishment that we managed to pull off. So many people suggest that Rookie being on level 7 and looking for level 9 is a direct showcase of Rookie descending to hell. And while I can see the search for level 9 as imagery to Rookie and Dante's Inferno, as in Dante's Inferno, Dante is constantly on his journey to reach the 9th circle of hell, I don't think that Data Hive necessarily is explicitly the 7th, 8th, and 9th circle of hell, but more the fact that Rookie is looking for the 9th level is the substantial part, because technically in this level you also go to the 10th sublevel and the 12th sublevel, which those don't necessarily line up to the Dante allegory. But get this, if we look at Inferno, we see that in the 8th circle of hell, this one that's reserved for fraud, it actually has 10 different chasms that each represent its own sin in the layer of fraud. And we could easily argue that the feeling of betrayal is so present when you're playing as Rookie after collecting all the audio logs and our officer bro turns on us and tries to kill us for his ulterior motives. And this is some really awesome imagery, especially because this happens in an area that's frozen over, which in those lower levels of hell, it gets colder and colder in Dante's Inferno. But when we went back and played through Firefight on ODST, we made this really cool discovery. Data Hive's firefight level that takes place right above the core is actually called Chasm 10, which is a direct and obvious homage to the 8th Circle of Hell that has those 10 chasms within it. Especially knowing that Bungie intentionally already was making connections to Dante's Inferno with Sadie's story, it's pretty obvious that this could not be coincidental. Also, a lot of people who make these theories point to Data Hive being the 9th level and possibly representation of the 9th circle. However, if you go on the original ODST and not the Master Chief Collection version, the level is actually listed as the 8th level, as Mombasa Streets falls below that, though that's likely coincidental, along with the fact that there's only 8 letters in Data Hive, which also is probably coincidental. But I'm pretty confident there's some serious imagery that as we go further down to the core, we're experiencing the transition of Rookie leaving the 8th circle of hell and entering the 9th circle, the lowest depths. Yeah, most likely Virgil is sitting here in the lowest level of hell, the 9th circle, which is the embodiment of treachery. And yeah, there's some brutes, and the doors are kind of labeled with these sideways 9s. I guess they could be 6s, but I mean, they look like 9s, even though this is sub-level 10, not sub-level 9. And even with all of these connections and theories, I never fully could understand how Virgil would be this embodiment of treachery being in that 9th circle. And I didn't think some brutes outside the door were a good representation either. And while I felt pretty strongly about the imagery for the 8th circle, I was having a lot of trouble piecing together how this would showcase the 9th circle, which would be the most important for some imagery following Rookie's story through hell. But ever since I was 14 and played through ODST for the first time at home with swine flu when this game first came out, the legendary ending of this game always stood out to me. The Prophet of Truth just shows up here in the post-credits scene, like it's some big, substantial reveal. And yeah, don't get me wrong, it shows how he found the Ark. But this game came out after Halo 3. Most Halo fans already played through that story. We already knew he had found the Ark. So what's the point of showing truth here in the first place? What's the significance here, and why are we revisiting the Data Hive as the last images we get for the story of ODST? Okay, so Dante's Inferno, the 9th circle, the biggest feature besides a cold frozen lake, note that the core is under the Oni building's lake, is in fact Satan himself there, the face of treachery, who massively betrayed, misled, and corrupted others. The whole existence of this legendary cutscene isn't to foreshadow something that already happened years ago in Halo 3's release, but it's to complete the Dante imagery, and it's absolutely brilliant. And of course, it also reveals that the glyphs are for the Prophet to find, and not for the ODSTs. But it gets even deeper, seriously. In the legendary edition of Halo 3 and the collector's edition, there's a book called the Bestiarium, which is included, and it gives a little bit of descriptions behind the different species found inside of the Halo universe. And if we go to San Shium, which is the species that the prophets are, their Latin name is Perfidia vermis, which directly translates, and get this, to worms of treachery. And the one place he shows up in our theory about the Dante allegory is in the 9th circle, which represents the sin of treachery itself. So yeah, I think a lot of people were really close in suggesting the 7th circle through the 9th circle representing in the first half of the level, but I think the real significance was the imagery of that search for the 9th level of hell, rather than hell actually being different floors in the Oni building. Matter of fact, if you're still not convinced that in ODST, New Mombasa was supposed to be this representation of hell on Earth, just pay attention to the dialogue in the game. The phrasing hell just pops up so many times that it almost feels like there's no way this was coincidental at times.
What the hell am I supposed to do with this?
And what the hell kind of armor was she wearing?
What the hell just happened?
Let's get the hell off this thing. This is gonna be one hell of a chain reaction.
Hell, I wouldn't go down there even if you ordered me to.
The whole city's gone to hell.
One hell of a team.
We went through hell for that?
What can I say? It was a hell of a night.
Also, we see graffiti that says Hell on Earth. The ODSTs are known for dropping feet first into hell. And on the streets, there's a bunch of other little things that you could interpret as allegories for Limbo, which is kind of the top level of hell, where it's this neutral, dark world, which is where Dante actually meets Virgil in Dante's Inferno. And we feel like the way that Rookie travels through the 9 circles of hell is kind of by experiencing everything that Sadie experienced. He experiences those circles of hell through Sadie's story and only gets the conclusion once he's in Data Hive, which is kind of a culmination of his own journey. We're not the first people to make the connection of Dante's Inferno to Halo 3 ODST, but we do think that these explicit details have been overlooked for the last decade, and it's really cool once you start to tie other things together. But if we're going to look at the rest of this giant mystery that we've been unpacking for months now, we definitely think we're going to have to start looking at some of these ideas and approaching them as a more abstract Easter egg than looking for something explicit that we might have missed along the way. And then lastly, one other little thing that I caught along the way is there's a ton of B references throughout ODST for whatever reason. If you look at the pamphlet, there's Buzz in there, and there's Stirring Up the Hive, and there's the level called Data Hive, and we're running around payphone to payphone, just like in the actual I Love Bees ARG. We don't know the full significance of that. I mean, there's even something called BNet that is spelled B-E-E, not just like the letter B. So that's crazy, but we just wanted to mention that too. So let's move into the section of the video where we talk about what we think and what theories we have, even though we don't necessarily have anything explicit telling us that this is necessarily the case. So understanding the depth and imagery used for the Dante stuff, we can start to draw connections and theories that these Easter eggs may be a more abstract homage to different literary works rather than an explicit and achievable Easter egg that players can experience. Now, imagery to different literary works are scattered all over the place in ODST, or at least potential literary homages. For instance, there's things like Brutus playing a large role in Dante's Inferno, or Dante having to tame a winged beast to fly through one of the circles of hell. There's a lot of possibilities, but nothing really definitive. And that's where we start to land with the Hollow Men. Now, of course, Hollow Men isn't something that's used explicitly or exclusively in ODST, and we suspect, just basing off of what we are able to understand from everything that has gone on in this investigation over the past few months, we think that Marty's tweet wasn't trying to show players that the Hollow Men is a one-to-one allegory of ODST. We think that the tweet actually served as a clue that we need to look deeper into literary allusions, and referring to ODST or Halo as the Land of Cactus might just be a literary title synonymous for the entire Halo universe. I guess what we're trying to say is that Marty calling it the Land of Cactus might not just be him trying to refer to ODST or leave some cryptic clue, but we think it could just be an allusion to the overall Halo universe, or another phrase, or maybe an internal phrase to refer to the universe of Halo, rather than just saying, hey, do you guys think we should uncover the glyphs from ODST? I mean, the term Land of the Cactus, which is very clearly referential to T.S. Eliot's poem Hollow Men, has sections of that poem that show up through all of Halo, whether it's Halo 3 or Halo 2. If you listen to music from Halo 3 and ODST and even Halo 2 backwards, you can hear lines from T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men as well. So the whole Land of the Cactus thing might not just be something exclusively talking about Squidhenge, but maybe it's a larger allusion in the Halo universe rather than just ODST. That's not saying we're ruling out the fact that there's clever imagery in ODST to T.S. Eliot's poem. A lot of the lines could be interpreted to different locales featured in ODST, though this is definitely more abstract imagery than a direct Easter egg that we can call conclusive. But a lot of people look at the Squidhenge section and relate it to the section of T.S. Eliot's poem where it states, "This is the dead land. This is Cactus Land. Here the stone images are raised. Here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand under the twinkle of a fading star." Could this be imagery? Absolutely. But is there any way we can definitively say that all of ODST is a retelling of Hollow Men based off of that? Probably not. But I think the true story here is that ODST as a whole is just a giant Easter egg with abstract allusions to different literary arts, which are experienced in this unique medium that kind of potentially ties this all together. I mean, we thought it was really crucial alone, the fact that in the beginning sections of Hollow Men, there's direct references that are pulled almost verbatim out of Dante's Inferno, describing the upper levels of hell. So there's definitely some interesting thing going on that could potentially tie all of this together, but there's just so much to unpack and try to piece through that it's very difficult to say one thing or another is true and something else is ruled out. Okay, so we do have a major breakthrough in at least understanding that this thing is probably more abstract, though we we haven't fully gotten to the bottom of everything else so far. We know the Dante Inferno has a major tie-in, and we know that more than likely those glyphs are not put by Virgil himself, but put by other engineers, and their motives might be more in line with the Covenant and less in line with the Superintendent, though that's still up for debate. We do have more leads that are super interesting, but let's get everyone on the same page first, because we really have gotten so much help from our community that we need to make sure everyone is kind of starting off at the same level. So let's debunk some of the biggest theories right now that are very popular that we think can't quite be put together or can't quite align with what we experience in ODST. Okay, going to Squidhenge, those dead elites throwing all of those grenades, super creepy. They stand up for a second and they fall apart, and we said this in the last video, we thought it was most likely a glitch and not a part of an Easter egg. There was still kind of the significance of people discovering that we wanted to include because it was very interesting. Matter of fact, Game Cheat actually went ahead and looked into this during this entire investigation, and he found that what he believed was happening in the game's code is that we were overloading the game by having all of the explosions go off at the same time, and there was something in line with the fact that the elites didn't have a proper death animation in ODST since they're never living, or another case that it was deloaded because of us overloading the map, actually caused the ODST engine to revert to its failsafe for physics on dead bodies, which is a line of code that is still apparently in the engine used for Halo 3 ODST, existing from the Halo Combat Evolved days. And if you remember back in Combat Evolved, it wasn't like a typical ragdoll type of death animation. It was kind of this weird scripted falling apart type thing, and he suspects that that line of code is being implemented onto the elites, and that's why this weird occurrence happens when you get a bunch of the bodies together and spam way more grenades than you ever should be able to. The other reason we're counting this as a debunked part is that other players have been able to recreate this glitch, but with dead Marines in ODST, which kind of confirms our belief that it's deloading some sort of death physics or something in that type of realm, and that's why this part is more coincidental and not actually a part of an Easter egg. A lot of people jump on our Discord, they tweet to us, they suggest different things. It's all awesome whenever people suggest ideas to us online, though we just want to include this in the video so maybe the frequency of it can slow down a little bit. But the J signs have been investigated up, down, left, and sideways. We know that they are not Braille, and also not Braille in any language that could potentially tie into ODST for whatever reason. We also know it's not Morse code. It's also not Morse code, to the one person who thought that's how it's said. And when translating it into binary, really doesn't make any sense, most likely. So we really don't have any explicit code from binary just yet based off of those J signs. We did really love the theory that the J signs were actually a type of serial code or barcode type thing for the trucks, the Oliphant garbage trucks that drive through the city and would pick up the trash, and they would use the different J signs in lore, of course, to identify what they're supposed to pick up, though the J signs show up in areas where a garbage truck would never be, so that one has to be debunked as well. We think from a technical standpoint, the reason there's 3 variations of these J signs and why they're all over the place is most likely they wanted to have signs throughout the streets of Mombasa to make it look like a realistic city. But since there's limitations as to how many signs they can design for the game, they instead went for these J dot type patterns and spread them out all through the game so that players can intentionally not understand what they say, but the aesthetic of the game still has the imagery of having signs and street signs, even though they're not actually present. This is most likely so when you're playing through the game, you don't run into 16 different supermarkets, if that's what the J dots said. Though, despite the utilization of it, we still feel like along the way, there most likely is some sort of secret code in there we just haven't figured out yet. That was also hidden in there, but the reasoning for them going with the J signs is most likely this theory. We also see a lot of people posting other glyphs from Halo, and if you look at Halopedia, which is a fantastic source for Halo information, they actually have all the different glyphs and Forerunner type of sigils that appear throughout the Halo universe, and yes, they are really interesting, and some of them out there in the Halo universe can be decrypted, and some of them not so much. But as far as we know, all of the extra glyphs and sigils that show up in the other Halo games don't have any direct connection to the glyphs that we see in ODST. Then there was a really interesting thing that popped up about these doors that showed up on our Discord, and people were really speculating what was going on here. But essentially, if you drive a mongoose up to one of these doors in this sector, Essentially, you'll hear some very fast-paced beeping. It sounds like there's actually exactly 7 beeps, though I couldn't initially tell. But by clipping through the door with a mongoose, you're kind of in this blank room, and all you hear is the beeping. And that was really odd because you're not supposed to be able to access these rooms anyways. And the doors have these green lights on them. So what's going on with these doors? Well, as far as we can tell, there's really nothing significant about these doors. It looks like what happened is, since a lot of ODST is repurposed for firefight mode, these doors, when any type of object moves through them, will beep like a metal detector, so that if you're in firefight mode and a wave of enemies, which can in fact spawn in this room, kind of just sneak up behind you, you at least have some sort of audio cue to know that that door opened up and enemies are pushing through, and that's what most likely triggers the beeps, not some secret coded message. And then if you mess around with the loading in the sunken plaza area, this one's really interesting for whatever reason, but occasionally these doors will be spawned open, but these can be recreated extremely easily to have it where these doors are open. And since it's just a matter of walking forward a little bit and walking backwards, we don't think it's necessarily explicitly reserved for the Easter egg, and it also is another one of those sections that open up for firefight where enemies can spawn in there and come out. And then one more piece of evidence we had regarding the superintendent and the engineers that we didn't really fit into the part we were talking about earlier is that for the people holding out that the superintendent did leave the glyphs for players to find and lead them on their way, the fact that in Sunken Plaza there's these glyphs literally everywhere, but there's not a single thing of significance in Sunken Plaza, really just leaves us completely puzzled, which makes us think that the glyphs aren't as reliable of a source as the other ways that Virgil tries to communicate with the player. Okay, so now let's look at some of the leads we have and things that we're still kind of questioning and we think really could help our investigation and more discoveries about this game if we can possibly conclude some of these things or figure out these really interesting oddities that happen in ODST. One thing we haven't talked about yet is Dare's escape in the Tayari Plaza level. We think this one's really unique because for whatever reason, she is stuck in her pod the whole time and just barely makes an escape, but somehow in the brief time that she gets found and Buck finds Dare's pod, she somehow managed to severely damage her helmet, leave it behind, jump out of her pod, close her pod behind her, and then escape completely out of the vicinity where Buck had no way to communicate with her. Also, this engineer holding her helmet that's really damaged is a little bit weird, and after he explodes during the cutscene, you'll see that his explosive casing is wedged into the wall right behind Buck, which we'll go back to that in a second. But we just find it really weird that we don't know anything about Dare's whereabouts throughout this entire thing. We actually really spent a lot of time investigating the different ending points of Mombasa Streets, because essentially if you load up on Mombasa Streets, you can complete the campaign in almost any order you want, with the exception of Data Hive and Coastal Highway always having to be the second to last and last levels. But after you find all of the clues, whichever level you do last, the Data Hive entrance will always be within the immediate vicinity of that last clue. So over the past few months, we've been playing through ODST and ending in different orders every time so we could see where the game would essentially allow us to enter the Data Hive from. If you do Tayari Plaza last, interestingly enough, the entrance to Data Hive is through the doors right next to Dare's pod, which makes us suspect that's how she got away so quickly. Still doesn't explain the thing with the pod door being shut though. We wondered for a while if maybe it's the case that she already was out of her pod and was trying to misdirect Buck, but that wouldn't really make too much sense either, so we don't really know what that could lead to. Another interesting thing is the beacons that are placed on different objects and points of interest that Virgil likely is the one that put them on. We'd like to say that it's possible the Covenant can recognize these beacons as well, including the engineers, because in most cases in that final cutscene where Dare calls to Rookie to go and end Mombasa Streets and find her in Data Hive, as soon as she says she's placing a beacon, which now we know is more than just like a HUD aspect, it's an actual thing in the game's canon, we see a phantom fly overhead right in the direction that the beacon is placed on, with a spotlight overhead, which could easily tie in to why there's a bunch of glyphs typically found around each point of interest and each beacon through Mombasa Streets, because they are able to identify that the superintendent is marking these points of interest for the rookie, and they're also on the search for the superintendent and this Forerunner artifact. It's a theory, but maybe it's some way to start to tie things together. Okay, besides the doors and the weird things going off of that, you can load and deload things along the way that are just a little bit odd and have these weird occurrences. For instance, we talked about how the super try loads and deloads and apparently is there sometimes and not there other times. Sometimes if you kill yourself and respawn, things are there, and that's really odd and we don't fully understand how it works. But we've seen some other things by glitching out of the map. Like for instance, when we were in Sector 4, but on the level Kazingo Boulevard instead of on Mombasa Streets, if we glitched into the area where one of the drop pods is, not one of the areas where Squidhenge typically is, you can actually see the shadows of where the columns would have been if it was Squidhenge, which is weird because there's only one Squidhenge in the whole thing. Also, when we went to the sunken plaza, we noticed that piece of debris that was embedded in the wall from the engineer exploding during the Tayari Plaza cutscene is also in the wall in Sunken Plaza, even though these are two completely different sectors in different locations. It's obvious a case of copy and paste and mirroring different places, but we just wanted to take note of that as well. Okay, and then another interesting thing is whenever Rookie is close to a beacon, he kind of has this audio cue that plays. It's kind of like this arpeggio sounding thing in the background, and it's always whenever one of the players gets close to one of the beacons. However, in the level where you're going up the elevator in the Oni building, you actually hear that same sound effect again for whatever reason while you're in the elevator, which makes us wonder if there's a significance, or maybe the engineer was trying to contact the ODSTs that were going up the elevator. We don't know, but we did think that was really interesting as well. And then another big suggestion that a lot of people have been talking about is whether or not the Y glyphs actually could serve as some sort of sentence structure within the larger scope of the Covenant, where the Y is kind of like a line that they write on in the same way we write on a straight line going across from left to right, and instead they write in Ys. But there's also a lot of really interesting possibilities that maybe the Y structure is a way to determine different things based off of all of the symbols that are nearby instead of one individual symbol. There's a lot of different possibilities that I've looked in personally, like whether or not it's some sort of binary tree, or I really like the idea of it maybe being some sort of Boolean switch, which is essentially a logical algorithm that determines if something's true or false. It's really confusing and it's way beyond my understanding from my 1 year of logic I took my freshman year in college. But maybe someone who has a more practical mind around computer science type things can look at the Y glyphs from that perspective and see if there's any massive discoveries that could be made from that. Because remember, these are people who are game developers at the end of the day who hid stuff in the game, and it wouldn't be beyond a game developer to understand things like Boolean switches if that's what they wanted to implement into an Easter egg. They've been in other games before as Easter eggs, like the turning test, so maybe they're in ODST as well. I don't know. But that's where we feel like we are with the ODST search right now. We do have a lot of other different mysteries and secrets in the Halo universe that we want to start spending some time exploring, and we do want to revisit this at some point, and we absolutely will when we have some new theories and new leads and new things to discover. So if you guys want to help out in the search, please do head over to our Discord and join the conversation on there. Also, for these longer videos and these very in-depth type things, we decided to launch a Patreon so we can kind of balance out our time when we have to spend way more time on these longer videos. So if you guys want to support us and go the extra mile and get some cool perks, we really appreciate you guys checking out our Patreon as well. And of course, a huge thank you to Tepic Dim, Zombie, Chris, Scatacycle, and Dashi, and literally everyone else who helped in any capacity along the way. But hey, if you guys like this video, make sure you guys subscribe with notifications on for more videos like this so you actually get notified whenever we actually put out content.
And make sure to check out our live streams at twitch.tv/RocketSlothYT. We stream there twice a week, sometimes even more.
Sometimes even less.